By July 1969, Indira Gandhi was under siege, fighting for political survival and for leadership of the Congress Party. In a strategic move on the 16th of July 1969, Indira took away the finance portfolio from her principal opponent, Morarji Desai, who promptly resigned from her cabinet.
Later, a presidential ordinance issued on 19th July nationalized 14 major banks. The step, said the Prime Minister, would quicken the pace of economic development.
Indira's nationalization spree quickly included major industries such as coal, heavy engineering and insurance. India's rapid descent into the well of authoritarian socialism begun. Soon, state enterprises became milch cows for politicians and a place to assure jobs for the boys. By the 1970s, Indira Gandhi's government had fine-tuned a controlled economy to an art form. A stifling array of permits and licenses ruled business. Known as the ubiquitous license permit Raj, it dictated who could produce what, how much, and the price they could sell it at. From automobiles to cement and textiles to technology, the controls subverted competition and created an unhealthy nexus between the politician, the bureaucrat, and the businessman. And through all this, the consumer was slowly and surely squeezed, increasingly left without voice and choice.
It was a drive to accumulate profits and to accumulate capital that was going on in the Indian economy, and that led to the breakdown of the laws of the system. So, for instance, the license permit quota Raj. The idea is that if there's illegality, then that illegality pervades everything, whether it's a license or it's a permit or it's a quota or it's public distribution system or it's a police collecting hafta.
The reality was brutal. Take it or lump it. No one image symbolized this more than the ambassador. A car manufactured from a mold discarded by the Morris Minor Company in the United Kingdom in the mid-1950s. And yet, the queues stretched credibility, and delivery often took a year. Then there was the bank clerk who took his team more seriously than clearing checks. Or workers who took state patronage of job security as an inalienable right. One after another, businesses became sick, and India became mired in a mess of its own making.
During the whole decade of the 70s, there were so many regulations. The Indian industry was stagnant. No new imported technology was by and large permitted to the private sector. There were strict restrictions on size, you could not grow, and it was a disastrous period. Customers suffered, they couldn't get what they wanted, and manufacturers could not grow.
By 1975, India's economy was in crisis. The economic system had degenerated. Inefficiency and corruption had become an inevitable byproduct of the license permit Raj. Jayaprakash Narayan called for Sampurna Kranti, total revolution. The agitation spearheaded by him was in essence an anti-corruption crusade. The country's macroeconomic indicators painted a dismal picture. For the entire 1970s, India's economy grew at an average of less than 4% a year and acquired the derisive moniker of the Hindu growth rate. In this atmosphere, those who prospered were businessmen who had acquired the skill of wading through the maze of bureaucratic and political arrangement.
Most companies, in one way or the other, most groups, private sector groups, use political influence, either friendships or contacts or even money power, which is very unfortunate. And a few groups, I would say Tata Group was in that, our group was in that, and there were a few others, I'm sure, who didn't do that. And partly their growth became very slow, and we only continued to exist, and to the extent we did succeed in spite of not utilizing political influence, was due to our, if I may use the word, competence, our steadfastness, that we didn't worry about it.
Massive state funds were invested in public sector undertakings in almost all areas: steel, power, telecommunications, and ludicrously even hotels and bread. In 1979, the government owned 98% of the coal business, 85% of banking, 100% of insurance, 100% of telecommunications, and amazingly 65% of the bread business. This was supported by a safety net of subsidies to the economically impoverished. But typically, often those who needed it most were deprived. Living at state expense became the ticket to ride.
Government became this central economic agent as against private sector or functioning markets. Government as the conductor of an orchestra where everybody has to be harmonized. And as a result, instead of producing music, we produced noise.
March 1977. Indira Gandhi's government lost the elections. The newly sworn-in ragtag coalition of parties agreed on two fundamental issues. One was their dislike for Indira, yet the other was their endorsement of her socialist policies. In fact, they went a step further. April 1977, the Coca-Cola Export Corporation was asked by the Reserve Bank of India to comply with two provisions of the 1973 Foreign Exchange Regulation Act, or FERA. FERA made it mandatory for foreign companies engaged in government-designated low-priority, low-technology industry to transfer 60% of shareholding and know-how to Indians. Industry Minister George Fernandez declared that Coca-Cola should conform to the FERA regulations. Coca-Cola chose to leave India. IBM followed.
Most people think that it was only ouster of Coca-Cola and that IBM is all that was achieved. That is not what was achieved. What I achieved is liberalizing. All this so-called liberalization which people used to talk about, I was the one who began the process of liberalization.
If Coke went, they ensured there was a state-sponsored cola brand as a defiant alternative called 77. It died an inevitable death. But it was in the throes of this misplaced celebration, indeed earlier, that the new motif of India's middle-class aspiration was to emerge. An automobile factory set up by Sanjay Gandhi called Maruti was a non-starter despite government largesse. By 1980, Indira Gandhi was back in power. By June that year, her heir apparent and youngest son, Sanjay, had died in a plane crash. After Sanjay's death, Mrs. Gandhi decided to nationalize the Maruti plant and called for global partners to make Sanjay's dream for a people's car come true. Suzuki Motors of Japan was chosen as equity partner. It was as if a dam of pent-up demand had burst wide open. In only a couple of years, Maruti became as ubiquitous as ambassadors were once. To own a Maruti was a dream easily aspired to. It renewed the concept of choice. And for almost a decade and a half, the Maruti family of autos commanded almost 80% of the market share in the country. Even today, in the middle of the biggest consumer boom and competitive surge in India, it controls over half the market. But it was during Rajiv Gandhi's government in 1984 that the first feeble attempts were made to dovetail the Indian economy into the global system.
Rajiv liberalized technology imports into India. So in a way, while he did not bring out major reforms like removing licenses or removing MRTP, he did bring out a mindset change towards a modernization and an open economy model without really putting into place the opening process.
Rajiv's own commitment to modernization played well with the middle class. The first stirrings of a consumerist society was visible. Here was a Prime Minister who didn't shy away from wearing Ray-Ban aviator glasses, driving SUVs at breakneck speed, or wearing Gucci shoes. It was officially possible to be pro-India and pro-aspiration.
What Rajiv Gandhi did was to pick on the agenda as it was evolving in the rest of the world. And that was an agenda based on individualization rather than on collectivization, where there was a sense, of social well-being. So that was replaced by the idea that individual well-being is important.
IBM came back. Pepsi made its mark. Computerization was in, and there was talk that Coke would soon be as well. Driven by brash winner-take-all companies such as Reliance Industries, the stock markets went through the roof as the company added 1 million investors to India's share bazaar. But a series of policy blunders brought the country to the brink of financial collapse. Imports zoomed while exports plummeted, and policy initiatives slowed to a trickle after the Bofors scandal of 1987.
Had Rajiv put into motion what happened in 1991 later, these kinds of things would have slowly blown away. Since he on one hand could not or did not do those radical measures, maybe time was too short, and Bofors hit him and many other halfway measures began to hit him, we did not go to the ascendancy that could have been possible.
By the end of 1990, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, oil prices began to climb up, and it underscored just how vulnerable India's economy was. In the space of months, an additional $2 billion was added to India's oil import bill. NRIs began to pull the plug on their foreign currency deposits held in India. The State Bank of India had to borrow $2 billion overnight to ensure essential imports continued to flow. By the beginning of 1991, India's foreign exchange reserves dwindled to $300 million, or enough for a week's imports. In April 1991, India was forced to pledge a small part of its gold reserves. The move was prudent, and the pledge worth $200 million came from confiscated gold that the State Bank held. But it became an emotional issue staked to the self-esteem of a nation. The point was that the Chandrasekhar government was fast running out of options. 21st of May 1991, Rajiv Gandhi was assassinated. Swept into power in a sympathy wave, the Congress chose P.V. Narasimha Rao as Prime Minister. And he in turn chose a highly qualified but unassuming economist bureaucrat as Finance Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh. P. Chidambaram was the new Commerce Minister, and technocrat Montek Singh Ahluwalia the Finance Secretary. Together with their backs to the wall, they unleashed from the July budget 100 days of historical policy blitz. The Congress party that had sworn by Nehruvian socialism for the past 45 years had been forced to rewrite the economic agenda.
All that we have done is we have changed instrumentality. There is an element of continuity. But as Panditji himself used to say, that we live in a dynamic world. Time doesn't stand still. Situations change. And therefore, he says the test of people is, I think, good leadership is that we should be able to change direction when changes is needed. Now, that does not mean that the objectives which Panditji had in mind, those objectives are irrelevant.
For the first time in 2 decades, the license permit Raj was under attack, and red tape stretched almost to breaking point. The government devalued the rupee, a major shift in attitude. New industrial and trade policies got rid of production and price controls.
PM giving the political support, Dr. Manmohan Singh giving the economic logic to these decisions, and the Commerce Ministry showing the way by taking the first concrete steps. So the first 100 days were indeed exciting. The first 10 or 12 days were the most difficult days. One after another, things followed. Industrial policy came. Immediate crisis was the exchange level, which had gone down to below $1 billion and was dwindling. I think Dr. Manmohan Singh got some positive feelers from IMF and World Bank. Earlier, even in Mr. Yashwant Sinha's time, a request had been sent to the IMF, not been processed. The first major decision that he had to take was on devaluation.
With the abolition of MRTP, or the Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Commission, companies were freed to growing as they saw fit. India opened up to foreign goods and competition. State-sponsored monopoly was out. The public sector was to privatize, and foreign direct investment in India's industry and financial markets welcome.
In the Finance Ministry, we were quite clear that we should get rid of these controls as quickly as possible and we would not have problems. Intellectual consensus only grew over time, and including from representatives of industry. The major industry associations in the first 3 or 4 years provided very solid support for the liberalization and the economic reforms.
Expectedly, the first signs of opposition to these moves came from senior Congress leaders. They were fearful of eroding their state-subsidized privileges and their populism-fed vote banks. Inevitable, liberal policy making was interpreted as a union budget dictated by the IMF and the World Bank.
I think the problem was that this was a big change in economic policy direction, and we had not prepared the country, I think, for those changes. So that was, I think, somewhat of a hurdle which affected the speed at which we could implement these changes.
If the stock markets were seen as a barometer of the country's economic health, it was obvious the reforms were paying rich dividends. But the system hadn't kept pace with changes it had triggered. April 1992, the country was stunned by a stock market scam. Flamboyant stockbroker Harshad Mehta, a brash, brassy Johnny-come-lately with a penchant for flashy cars and instant fame, was at the centre of the 3,000 crore rupees rip-off. He and a cartel of brokers and bankers fraudulently used billions of rupees of public money to finance a bull run that took the Bombay Stock Exchange sensitive index to euphoric heights. They made money hand over fist. But when the scam came unstuck, so did the markets. It exposed a rot that India's financial and stock market regulatory system still hasn't been able to fully stop.
In a liberalized economy, people must understand we do need regulations. We don't want controls, but you need a regulatory framework so that we can't go back to the wild west of the 18th century. You can't have a situation where people can do what they want and you see a UTI scam or a Harshad Mehta scam. And there must be regulatory mechanism in place in such a way that such scams to a large extent are prevented. To a large extent, people will know even if it's not prevented, if they do that, they will get caught and go to jail. So it's a deterrent. Those things didn't exist, and he was made a god and he was glorified by everybody, and that perhaps encouraged him to do more than what he should have done.
But change wasn't all about unsavory reality checks. The economic landscape was being forced to change by the media. If cable TV brought home stunning images from the Gulf War, it also played over and over the breakup of the Soviet Union. Satellite television was by now offering the consumer dozens of channels, beaming global images of attitude, dress and products. And a newly freed market economy found a new voice as well as forum to woo willing consumers with. International brands, seduced by the sheer size of the Indian middle class, came in droves. Globalization became the new buzzword.
Look at the consulting firms in India, global consulting firms, and names after names. They didn't exist in India. Very small presence. Today they are employing 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people. Doing what? Restructuring Indian companies to become globally competitive. So the change is massive.
But the new sheen and gloss of the Indian economy could not hide the deep divisions and political agendas tearing at India. Narasimha Rao now found himself battling his political adversaries with Ayodhya and Ram Mandir firmly back in the centre stage. The demolition of the Babri Masjid on the 6th of December 1992 sparked off rioting across India. In January 1993, India's commercial capital, Bombay, was torn apart by communal rioting, followed in March by a series of bomb blasts that killed hundreds. Many observers feel that after this, the impetus to the economic reforms also lost force.
Good days continued well into the end of '92. The Babri Masjid demolition was a defining moment. And after that, Mr. Narasimha Rao turned his attention to political management, survival, rather than to economic issues. Virtually half of '93, the whole of '94 were wasted years. But then that is the price we pay for people who put on the mask of reformers without conviction.
But liberalization and aspiration had taken root too strongly to be brushed aside. Despite the inability to accelerate reforms, a new India was emerging. In 1994, Coca-Cola came back to India with a flashy launch in Agra, a symbol of significant corporate homecoming. India made a commitment to join the World Trade Organization, which ensured it reduce trade barriers, open up to imports, and compete to live. World-class products and services have started to take over India's shops, homes, and lives, many of them made in India. From state-run telecom gridlock Cell phone networks now girdle the country. Private companies now make phone instruments and run telephone networks. In 1976, there were 3 car models. Today there are over 75, represented by most global car makers. Private banks were hardly ever permitted to expand. Today, private banks are dragging state-run banks with them to automate and provide world-class service. Insurance was closed. Now it's open to Indians and the world. From food to fashion, there is quality choice.
It's not a question of shifting from liberalization to more of the same or more of the state control. The real choice is today not between liberalization and state control, even if poverty were to be the main objective of our country, which I think it should be. The real choice is in improving government delivery of services.
And there was this new buzz phrase that started to envelop India's future: information technology. There was no stopping this juggernaut that first grew quietly and then with increasing brashness. The country's corporate czars now counted among them names that were driving forces and poster boys for the new Indian economy. People like Infosys chairman N.R. Narayana Murthy and Wipro Corporation's Azim Premji.
92% of our business is in information technology. We have a traditional business, but it's run like a separate company. It has a vice chairman. So the thrust of the company is really information technology, and that is what we intend to concentrate on, because we see enormous global opportunities and enormous domestic opportunities in information technology, and primarily in services and solutions in information technology.
In less than a decade, information technology exports are expected to equal the value of all of India's exports today, turning India into a global powerhouse. NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchange are the new touchstones for Indian companies. Davos is now as much a destination for Indian businesspersons as Delhi. A roll call of the world's CEOs, from Jack Welch of GE to Microsoft's Bill Gates, is now routine for India.
I'm very excited to be here today to announce this alliance between Infosys and Microsoft. I think it's a great example of how far both companies have come and how these two companies are really going to tackle ambitious projects in the future.
Talk about the economy growing by 10% is no longer a question about how, but when. And political parties can no longer wish away the fact that a vibrant economy and more jobs is the way to re-election.
India has very high growth potential. It has the ability, and not only the potential, to become one of the fastest growing economies in the world. And it's also well established that if we grow at the sort of rate that we can grow, 7%, 8%, then poverty would be a thing of the past in about 20 years' time. And that is what we should be doing.
Great changes percolating into the metros and vibrant smaller towns of India. Ludhiana, Jalandhar, Coimbatore or Gorakhpur. An endless list. And even to many villages. This will ensure progress. It's all about choice and an aspiration to live a better life that demands more from everybody. In India, the consumer is finally king.